Imagine, if you will, this scenario unfolding right now, today, somewhere in the world, whether by deliberate decision of a hostile nation, by accident, by miscommunication, or through the actions of a rogue element. A nuclear-armed ballistic missile is launched toward the United States. What happens in the next 30 minutes will determine the fate of millions of people and potentially alter the course of human civilization. To understand this fully, we need to walk through every stage of what would occur, from the first moment of detection to the long-term consequences that would unfold over months and years. We need to understand the technology, the human decision-making, the protocols, the failures that could happen, and the cascading effects that would ripple across every aspect of modern life. The first thing you need to understand is that the United States maintains one of the most sophisticated early warning systems ever created. The moment a ballistic missile launches anywhere on Earth, multiple detection systems immediately identify it. Satellites in geosynchronous orbit, equipped with infrared sensors, detect the heat signature of the rocket's exhaust plume within seconds of ignition. These Defense Support Program satellites and their newer space-based infrared system replacements constantly scan the planet, looking for the telltale thermal bloom that indicates a missile launch. The data from these satellites is transmitted instantly to command centers including NORAD headquarters deep inside Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado and to Strategic Command at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. Within 30 seconds of launch, commanders would know that a missile is in the air, and sophisticated computers would begin calculating its trajectory. But satellite detection is only the first layer. Ground-based radar systems, including the upgraded early warning radars in Alaska, California, Massachusetts, Greenland, and the United Kingdom, would track the missile as it rises above the horizon. These powerful phased-array radars can track hundreds of objects simultaneously and can distinguish between actual warheads and decoys or debris. The data from satellites and radars is fused together by advanced computer systems that calculate the missile's trajectory with increasing precision as it flies, determining where it was launched from, how fast it's traveling, and most critically, where it's going to impact. Within 3 to 5 minutes of launch, military commanders would have a high-confidence assessment of whether this missile poses a threat to United States territory. Now comes the human element, and this is where things become incredibly complex and time-compressed. The President of the United States would be immediately notified through the emergency alert system carried by military aides who are with the President at all times. If the President is in the White House, he or she would be rushed to the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. If traveling, secure communications would be established immediately. The President would have approximately 6 to 10 minutes to make the most consequential decision any human being can make, whether to order a nuclear retaliation before the incoming warhead detonates. This is the essence of the nuclear doctrine known as launch on warning, and it's one of the most terrifying aspects of nuclear strategy because it compresses world-changing decisions into a time frame shorter than it takes to cook a meal. Let's pause here and consider what's running through the minds of the decision-makers in these crucial minutes. They need to assess, is this attack real or could it be a false alarm? History tells us false alarms have happened, including a famous incident in 1979 when a training tape accidentally made it appear that a massive Soviet attack was underway, and another in 1983 when Soviet satellites mistook sunlight reflecting off clouds for missile launches. Is this a single weapon or the first wave of a larger attack? Who launched it? Was it a nation-state with a return address that can be held accountable, or a terrorist group operating from ambiguous territory? What is the appropriate response? These questions must be answered in minutes, while knowing that millions of lives hang in the balance. Simultaneously with these deliberations, the United States military would activate defensive systems. The ground-based mid-course defense system, with interceptor missiles in Alaska and California, would prepare to launch. These interceptors are designed to strike an incoming warhead in space during the mid-course phase of its flight, when it's traveling through the vacuum above the atmosphere. The technology is complex, and success rates in tests have been mixed, around 50% in realistic scenarios. Each interceptor costs approximately $300 million, and multiple would likely be launched at a single incoming warhead to increase the probability of a successful intercept. The Aegis ballistic missile defense system on Navy ships positioned around the world could also attempt an intercept if the missile's trajectory brings it within range. Patriot and THAAD missile defense batteries protecting specific high-value targets might prepare for terminal phase intercepts if the warhead survives the mid-course defense attempts. But here's the sobering reality that defense experts understand, but the public often doesn't. Missile defense is extremely difficult and not guaranteed to work. Intercepting a warhead traveling at 15,000 miles per hour or faster in the vacuum of space has been compared to hitting a bullet with another bullet. Modern warheads can maneuver, can deploy decoys and chaff to confuse defensive systems, and can be designed to survive near misses. If a sophisticated adversary like Russia or China launched a missile, it would likely be accompanied by penetration aids specifically designed to defeat our defenses. If the attack came from a less sophisticated actor like North Korea, the defenses would have a better chance of success, but still no guarantee. The uncomfortable truth is that if a nuclear weapon is launched at the United States, there's a significant probability it will reach its target. Let's say the worst happens, the defensive systems fail or only partially succeed, and a nuclear warhead detonates over or in an American city. What happens next depends enormously on the size of the weapon and where exactly it detonates. Modern nuclear weapons vary tremendously in yield. A smaller tactical nuclear weapon might be 10 to 20 kilotons, similar to the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A strategic thermonuclear warhead could be anywhere from 100 kilotons to over a megaton, with some weapons in the Russian arsenal reportedly up to 50 megatons, though such massive weapons are considered impractical and unlikely to be used. Let's consider a scenario involving a medium-sized strategic warhead of around 500 kilotons detonating over a major American city, say New York or Los Angeles, as these would be high-priority targets for any adversary. If the warhead detonates as an airburst, exploding several thousand feet above the ground to maximize the radius of destruction, the immediate effects would be catastrophic beyond imagination. The nuclear fireball itself would be several thousand feet in diameter, with temperatures exceeding the surface of the sun. Everything within roughly 1 mile of ground zero would be instantly vaporized. Buildings, vehicles, people, everything would simply cease to exist, converted to plasma and then to radioactive vapor. The thermal pulse, the intense flash of heat radiation, would extend much farther. Within a 2 to 3 mile radius, every combustible material would ignite simultaneously. People caught in the open would suffer fatal third-degree burns. The thermal pulse lasts only a couple of seconds, but in that time, it would create hundreds of thousands of casualties. Many people would be permanently blinded by the flash, even at distances of dozens of miles, if they happened to be looking in the direction of the explosion. Then comes the blast wave, traveling outward at hundreds of miles per hour. Within a half-mile of ground zero, the overpressure would exceed 20 pounds per square inch, completely destroying even reinforced concrete structures. Between a half-mile and 2 miles, overpressure of 5 to 20 psi would collapse most residential and commercial buildings, trapping or crushing anyone inside. The blast would hurl debris at lethal velocities, turning every object into shrapnel. Between 2 and 4 miles from ground zero, buildings would be severely damaged, though some might remain partially standing. The winds accompanying the blast wave would exceed 200 miles per hour near ground zero, decreasing with distance but remaining hurricane force for miles. These winds would snap trees, overturn vehicles, and scatter burning debris across vast areas, starting countless secondary fires. The human toll in the first seconds and minutes would be unfathomable. In a dense urban area like Manhattan or downtown Los Angeles, a 500-kiloton airburst would kill several 100,000 people instantly, or within the first few minutes from the thermal pulse and blast effects. The number of severely injured would be similar or higher, overwhelming any conceivable medical response. Hospitals within the damage zone would be destroyed or rendered inoperable. Medical personnel would be among the casualties. The survivors in the surrounding areas would suffer from burns, crush injuries, lacerations from flying glass and debris, ruptured eardrums from the overpressure, and countless other trauma injuries. There would be no effective way to provide medical care to most of these people in the crucial first hours when treatment would matter most. Now consider what happens to the infrastructure of a modern city when a nuclear weapon detonates. The electromagnetic pulse generated by a nuclear explosion, particularly if it's a high-altitude burst, would destroy or damage unshielded electronics across a wide area. Power grids would fail. Communication systems would be knocked out. Traffic control systems, water treatment facilities, emergency service dispatch systems, hospital equipment, all would be compromised or destroyed. Even outside the immediate blast zone, the loss of electrical power and communications would hamper rescue and response efforts. First responders would have difficulty communicating with each other or receiving information about where help is needed most. The command and control infrastructure for managing a disaster of this magnitude simply wouldn't function. The fires started by the thermal pulse and by ruptured gas lines and scattered burning debris would quickly grow and merge into mass fires covering dozens of square miles. In the chaos following the blast, with water mains broken, fire departments destroyed or overwhelmed, and roads blocked by debris, these fires would burn largely unchecked. In some conditions, particularly in dense urban areas, these fires could develop into a firestorm, a self-sustaining inferno, where the intense heat creates its own weather system, sucking in air from the surroundings and creating winds of hurricane force that feed the flames. The firestorm that developed after the conventional bombing of Hamburg in World War II killed tens of thousands. A nuclear-initiated firestorm could be far larger and more deadly, potentially killing more people than the immediate blast effects. Then there's the radioactive fallout, and this is where the effects extend far beyond the immediate target area. When a nuclear weapon detonates, it creates hundreds of different radioactive isotopes. If the fireball touches the ground, or the weapon is designed as a ground burst, it will vaporize and irradiate tons of soil, concrete, and other materials, which then condense around the radioactive particles and fall back to Earth as fallout. The heaviest particles fall within minutes in the immediate vicinity, but lighter particles can be carried by winds for hundreds of miles, creating a fallout plume that deposits deadly radiation far from ground zero. The amount and distribution of fallout depend on many factors, including weapon design, height of burst, weather conditions, and wind patterns. People in the path of heavy fallout who don't reach shelter quickly could receive fatal doses of radiation within hours. Even those who survive the initial exposure would face increased cancer risks for the rest of their lives. The fallout would contaminate water supplies, agricultural land, and structures, making large areas potentially uninhabitable for years or decades. Cleanup of fallout is enormously difficult and expensive. After the Chernobyl disaster, which released far less radioactive material than a nuclear weapon would, Cleanup and containment efforts cost hundreds of billions of dollars and are still ongoing nearly 40 years later. The economic and human cost of fallout from a nuclear attack would be incalculable, but we're only beginning to understand what would happen if a nuclear bomb was launched at the United States today. Everything I've described so far is just the direct, immediate physical effects in the target area. The second-order effects and the national and global consequences would be equally profound and far-reaching. Let's consider what happens in the hours and days after the detonation. The president, assuming he or she survived the attack, would be faced with the decision of how to respond. The entire national security apparatus would be operating under the assumption that this could be the first strike of a larger attack. Strategic nuclear forces would be placed on the highest alert. Ballistic missile submarines would prepare to launch. Bomber aircraft would be dispersed from their bases and possibly loaded with nuclear weapons. Land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles would be readied for launch. The pressure to retaliate would be immense, both from military advisors arguing that failing to respond would invite further attacks, and from the public demanding revenge and justice. But retaliation against whom? If the attack came from a nation-state with a known nuclear arsenal like Russia, China, or North Korea, attribution would be relatively straightforward, though the consequences of retaliation would risk escalation to all-out nuclear war that could end civilization. If the weapon was traced to a terrorist group or a rogue state with an ambiguous nuclear program, determining the appropriate target for retaliation would be far more complex. Do you retaliate against the country from whose territory the launch occurred, even if that government claims it wasn't responsible? Do you strike nuclear facilities, leadership targets, military forces? Each option carries different risks of escalation and different moral implications. The domestic situation within the United States would be chaotic beyond description. Even far from the attack site, panic would grip the nation. Financial markets would crash as trading was suspended or as investors fled to safety. Grocery stores would be stripped bare within hours as people panic-bought supplies. Gas stations would run out of fuel as people tried to flee cities, fearing additional attacks. The economy would enter a crisis that would make 2008 or the COVID pandemic look mild by comparison. Every sector would be affected. International trade would be disrupted as allies and partners tried to understand what was happening and whether they too were at risk. The dollar could lose its status as the global reserve currency if confidence in American stability collapsed. The social fabric would be tested in unprecedented ways. There would be an immediate rally around the flag effect as Americans united in grief and determination, similar to but far more intense than what followed September 11th. But there would also be divisions. Debates would rage about how to respond, about whether the government had done enough to prevent the attack, about intelligence failures, about whether the response was too aggressive or too weak. Civil liberties would likely be curtailed in the name of security. Surveillance would increase. Ethnic or religious groups associated with the attackers would likely face discrimination or worse. The political landscape would be transformed, with security hawks likely gaining power and more dovish voices marginalized. Let's talk about the long-term health consequences for survivors and responders. Those exposed to significant radiation would face acute radiation syndrome in the days and weeks after exposure, with symptoms ranging from nausea and fatigue to hemorrhaging and death, depending on the dose received. Those who survived acute effects would have elevated cancer risks for the rest of their lives. First responders and military personnel involved in rescue and cleanup operations would face exposure risks even if they entered the area days or weeks after the attack. The experience of Chernobyl liquidators and Fukushima workers shows that even with protective equipment, those involved in nuclear disaster response often suffer health consequences for years afterward. The psychological trauma would affect not just those directly exposed, but the entire nation. Mental health services would be overwhelmed with people suffering from PTSD, anxiety, depression, and grief. Suicide rates would likely spike. Drug and alcohol abuse would increase as people sought to cope with trauma and uncertainty. Children who lost parents or who witnessed the horrors would carry scars for life. The collective psyche of the nation would be altered, with increased anxiety about future attacks affecting behavior and decision-making for generations. Think about how September 11th changed American culture and multiply that by orders of magnitude. Now let's consider the international ramifications. Every nation on Earth would be watching how the United States responds. Allies would be calling for measured responses while offering support. Adversaries would be calculating their own vulnerability and taking steps to protect themselves. The United Nations Security Council would meet in emergency session, though its ability to take meaningful action would depend on whether a permanent member was responsible for the attack. If the United States retaliated with nuclear weapons, the taboo against nuclear use that has held since 1945 would be shattered, potentially opening the door to further nuclear use by other nations. The entire architecture of non-proliferation and arms control treaties could collapse as nations decided they needed nuclear weapons for their own protection. Regional conflicts around the world might escalate as actors took advantage of American distraction and the chaos in the international system. Adversaries might see an opportunity to advance their interests while the United States was reeling. Taiwan, Ukraine, the Korean Peninsula, the Middle East, all could see increased tensions or outright conflict. The global economy would enter a severe recession or depression as trade networks collapsed, commodity prices spiked, and uncertainty paralyzed investment and consumption. Developing nations dependent on American aid or trade would face humanitarian crises. The impact would be felt in every corner of the globe. Let's think about the specific scenario of what cities or targets might be chosen and why. An adversary seeking maximum casualties and psychological impact would target major population centers like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, or Houston. An adversary seeking to decapitate American leadership and command authority might target Washington, D.C., though this risks killing diplomats and representatives of many other nations, which could turn potential allies against the attacker. An adversary seeking to cripple American military response capability might target nuclear forces bases, bomber bases, submarine ports, or command centers, though many of these are hardened against attack and geographically dispersed. An adversary seeking economic disruption might target major ports like Los Angeles, Houston, or New York, or financial centers like Manhattan or Chicago. Each choice would have different casualty profiles and different strategic implications. The recovery from such an attack would take decades at minimum. The physical reconstruction of destroyed areas would require trillions of dollars and many years. Radioactive contamination might render some areas uninhabitable for generations. The economic disruption would require a massive recovery effort similar to the Marshall Plan after World War II, but this time the United States would be the one needing assistance rather than providing it. The political consequences would reshape American society and foreign policy for the foreseeable future. Relations with the nation responsible would be permanently altered. American attitudes toward nuclear weapons, defense spending, international engagement, civil liberties, and countless other issues would shift in ways we can only begin to imagine. Think about the changes in daily life for average Americans far from the attack site. Security screening would become far more intensive and ubiquitous. The ability to move freely would be curtailed. Privacy would be sacrificed for security. The economy would shift toward defense and security industries. Consumer spending would decline as people saved more out of fear and uncertainty. The culture would become more martial, and security-focused. Education would incorporate nuclear attack preparedness. Architecture would change to include blast protection and fallout shelters. The optimism and openness that have characterized American culture would give way to suspicion and fear. Yet there's another aspect to consider: human resilience and adaptability. Americans and humans generally have shown remarkable ability to endure catastrophe and rebuild. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those cities rebuilt and are now thriving. After devastating wars and disasters throughout history, societies have recovered. The United States has enormous resources, both material and human, that could be mobilized for recovery. The technological and scientific expertise to manage nuclear contamination and rebuild exists. The question isn't whether recovery would happen, but how long it would take, at what cost, and what kind of nation would emerge from the trauma. We should also discuss the reality that this scenario, while possible, faces significant barriers to actually occurring. The nations with sophisticated nuclear arsenals and reliable delivery systems have strong incentives not to attack the United States directly because they know retaliation would be devastating. The concept of mutually assured destruction, while horrifying, has kept nuclear-armed rivals from direct conflict for nearly 80 years. Rogue states or terrorist groups face enormous technical and logistical challenges in acquiring a nuclear weapon and a delivery system capable of reaching the United States. It's far easier to acquire or build a crude nuclear device than to build a reliable intercontinental ballistic missile. More likely scenarios for nuclear terrorism involve devices smuggled into the country or detonated at closer range, which would have different characteristics than an ICBM attack. The international community, including adversaries, has some interest in preventing nuclear attacks because of the chaos and unpredictability that would follow. Even nations hostile to the United States might prefer a stable international order to the chaos that would follow a nuclear attack. Intelligence services around the world cooperate, however reluctantly, to prevent nuclear proliferation and terrorism. The IAEA monitors nuclear materials. Export controls limit access to critical technologies. These systems aren't perfect, but they create obstacles that have, so far, prevented the nightmare scenario we're discussing. But the possibility, however remote, remains real. And that's why the United States and other nations invest so heavily in early warning systems, missile defenses, nuclear forensics, non-proliferation efforts, and consequence management planning. The government has detailed plans for continuity of operations, for evacuating leadership, for managing the aftermath of a nuclear attack. These plans are tested and updated regularly. First responders train for nuclear scenarios, even though they hope never to face one. The entire apparatus of nuclear deterrence and defense exists because the consequences of failure are simply too catastrophic to accept. What would happen if a nuclear bomb was launched at the United States today? In the best case, early warning systems detect it, defenses intercept it, a crisis is averted, and we learn from the close call to strengthen our systems and defenses. In the worst case, a weapon detonates, killing hundreds of thousands immediately and condemning many more to death from injuries and radiation, triggering a response that could escalate to broader nuclear war, permanently altering the trajectory of human civilization. Between these extremes lie a range of scenarios involving partial defensive success, limited retaliation, and consequences that would test every institution and aspect of American society. The reality is that in the nuclear age, we live with existential risk that previous generations never faced. And managing that risk requires constant vigilance, sophisticated technology, wise leadership, and a measure of luck. Understanding what would actually happen in such a scenario isn't about spreading fear. It's about appreciating the stakes involved, the systems designed to protect us, and the imperative to prevent this scenario from ever becoming reality. And if you'd like, tell me where in the world you're watching this video from. Your comment is important, and I want to read and respond to it. For more exciting stories like this, click on the video that's playing on your screen right now.